to the Whiskey Explorer. Thanks so much for tuning in for this episode, guys. And if this is your first time on the channel, if you could please do us a quick favor, smash that subscribe button, hit the like button, turn on the bell notifications so you know when we are dropping new videos. And we'd love to have you in the conversation here at the Whiskey Explorer, so please drop a comment down below. Let us know if you like this type of video, and we'll get the conversation continued with all the fine folks that join us here on the Whiskey Explorer. Alright, and today, guys, we've got a very interesting topic to explore, something a little bit off the beaten path, not just a straight review, but let's talk about NDPs. So what is an NDP? Well, an NDP is a non-distilling producer. So that is a company that is maybe just starting out with their bourbon brand or their rye brand or their American whiskey or their Canadian whiskey for that matter, and they don't quite have their bourbon or their rye or their whiskey ready to age yet. So basically when you start a distillery, you've got to wait quite a bit of time if you want to do a bourbon or a whiskey where it has time that it needs to age in the charred oak barrels, right? So what companies do is sometimes they will have gin or vodka or clear spirits to help their distillery get off to a good start and raise some capital for their bourbon or their whiskey or their American whiskey production. So in that meantime, lots of other companies choose to source their whiskey from a big commercial distilling outfit like MGP, which is now of course rebranded to Ross and Squibb. And they will source that whiskey, and they might do some blending in-house, they might do some additional aging in-house, but then essentially they're bottling someone else's product and selling it under their label. So that's what we call a non-distilling producer. And of course, with the popularity and the huge boom in bourbon, we are seeing a lot of these NDPs in the bourbon world. So I remember that sourcing was really frowned upon in the whiskey community. So it started out with some shady business, of course. You're always going to have that, the controversy, the kind of, stuff that's not quite too savory in the whiskey production world. So there was one company that made this kind of famous, and I'm not going to share their name on here. I don't want to blast anyone on the channel, but this particular company was actually sourcing rye, and they were putting their own label on it, and they were not being transparent that it was being sourced. So essentially they were maybe not intentionally doing it, but they were claiming by not saying who they sourced their whiskey from or that it was sourced at all, they were sort of saying, hey, this is our product, we're distilling this, we're producing this, we're making this, we're bottling it, we're labeling it, it's our stuff. And it turned out that it was actually not their stuff, and it was sourced MGP rye. So sort of with that kind of controversy and maybe some other distilleries or bourbon brands or American whiskey brands that weren't necessarily being super transparent about sourcing their whiskey, it was initially sort of frowned upon. Now, however, fast forward 4 or 5 years, and you've got this huge boom in bourbon popularity, and people are struggling who are starting out their new brands to get a following for their name, to get people interested in their label, to get people interested in their brand, because as you know, it takes 2 to 3 years at a minimum to have decently aged bourbon whiskey that you can sell. And one of the other challenges you have with a distillery that's starting out is you don't want to release your juice too young. So let's say that you just started a bourbon brand, you've got a brilliant marketing team, you've got awesome branding, you've got a lot of people that are interested in your company, and you are feeling the pressure of putting out a product, so you rush it to market and you release a 2-year whiskey. And that 2-year whiskey sucks. And people buy it up, they like your branding, they like your image, they like your company, what you stand for, so they go out and they rush out to try to buy your bourbon, to try it out, and your 2-year-old whiskey is crap. Well, suddenly you've got a huge consumer base that is going to have a really sour taste in their mouth from that bourbon brand releasing a whiskey that was too young. So that's where we get to now, where these companies are sourcing their whiskeys, and perhaps they're doing a little bit of additional aging in-house, perhaps they're doing some blending like Penelope, and then they're releasing it under their label. But essentially the actual liquid that's inside the whiskey has been contract distilled through another company like MGP, Bardstown Bourbon Company, 1792. So essentially those bigger brands, or those brands that are set up for production and have aged stock, are then going basically in a brokerage type of situation, selling those barrels of aged whiskey to these non-distilling producers. The non-distilling producer is saying, okay, great, now we've got some aged product, we're going to blend this, we're going to bottle it, and we're going to put our name on it. So what are some of the common brands that you find out there that are NDPs, or non-distilling producers? So tonight in the glass I have got a really nice product here. I have got the Redwood Empire Lost Monarch. So this is actually a Boo Rye, so that means that it's a blend of bourbon and rye whiskeys, and this is actually sourced from MGP, which if you've kind of watched the channel for a bit, you know I really don't like the rebranding of MGP to Ross and Squibb. Hate using that name. I think it's a totally stupid distillery name. Not a huge fan of that at all, so I just go with MGP. But MGP is of course the giant out of Indiana, massive bourbon rye American whiskey producer. They also do light whiskeys. So they've got the warehouse space, they've got the rick houses, they've got the distillation, they've got the stills. They are producing a massive amount of American whiskey, and they are selling that aged product coming from the rick houses to other companies so that other companies can get a start in the bourbon game. So one of those is Redwood Empire out of California. So they are sourcing from MGP at the moment. But what's cool about Redwood Empire is that since they've started their brand, they're also distilling their own stuff. Okay, so they're actually producing ryes, they're actually producing bourbons, but they're just not quite old enough to bottle exclusively and put out to market. And what I really respect about Redwood Empire is that they've actually waited, right? So in that example I gave earlier, they didn't rush out and put out a 2-year bourbon that was crappy and sort of turned off a lot of consumers. They're actually waiting until their stocks are mature so they can release their own product. So maybe their own rye, their own bourbon, maybe a Boo Rye, maybe a 4-grain, we'll see. But they're waiting until it actually is mature. So I think when Redwood Empire is ready, they're going to produce and release all of their own. I think they're going to try to wean off of MGP as a contract distiller or as a sourced whiskey, and I think they're going to be producing their own stuff and bottling that exclusively for the Redwood Empire brand. And I think that's going to happen at about 4 years old. So this Redwood Empire Lost Monarch is a 4-year bourbon rye mix from MGP, so I think we can definitely expect to see some great product coming from Redwood Empire. They're already starting to blend in their own juice with the sourced MGP product, so that's super cool. So quick sip here, Redwood Empire. Cheers. That one's a really fantastic summer whiskey. You get the crisp rye notes, you get, you know, some herbal quality to that. You get fresh green apple on the palate. You get vanilla, you get a little bit of oak. You get some confectionery sugar. Just a beautiful, well-rounded whiskey. So there you go. That's one of the non-distilling producers. There are many, many more. So you may have heard of this one here, Doc Swinson's. So Doc Swinson is another company that is sourcing from MGP, or of course now Ross and Squibb. This one here is the Blender's Cut. So they are actually sourcing MGP, and then their master distiller or their master blender is then doing some blending in-house, then they're releasing under their own label of Doc Swinson's. And they've got some really interesting finished whiskeys, they've got some interesting finished Solera ryes. So they're doing really cool things there. It's just they don't have a product of their own yet that is old enough to release, so they are sourcing their whiskey and taking that stock from MGP. Another one to mention here is Lux Row. This is the old Ezra 7-year-old barrel strength. This is sourced from Heaven Hill, but recently, it was I think sort of about 6 months to a year ago, I think it was more like a year ago, Lux Row was acquired by MGP, so MGP or Ross and Squibb now owns Lux Row Distillery. They own that whole company and their whole beverage portfolio. So I think that we're going to see a lot of the Lux Row products, you know, Blood Oath, Davies County, Old Ezra, Ezra Brooks. I think we're going to see the sourcing change from Heaven Hill to actually being sourced from MGP. But again, Lux Row has its own distillery. They've got a visitor center there. They've got a restaurant experience, a whole hospitality experience. It's on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. It's supposed to be excellent to go visit the distillery. So they are also producing their own stock as well. And I think we're going to see that, being mixed in with the MGP to start until they have a aged product that they can release on its own without the backing of the sourcing from MGP. Another one to mention is Old Scout. So Old Scout is another of the non-distilling producers, NDPs. Old Scout was famous for having really, really good MGP barrels at around the 7 to 11 year age. They were single barrels at cask strength, and sadly, due to the bourbon craze, those single barrels at that age point, 7 to 11 years, have just dried up. So you don't see too many Old Scouts that are in that age range anymore. I have seen from some friends and other bourbon channels in the United States, there are still some 6 to 7 year MGP sourced Old Scouts at cask strength that are floating out there. But the best that I could do here in Canada was a 5-year, 58.4% ABV Old Scout single barrel sourced from MGP. So those are some of the kind of non-distilling producers of note. Of course, there's many more out there as the bourbon industry gets more and more popular. You have more and more of these brands starting up, and they need some aged stock to sell before their own distillate is ready for releasing to the public at a good enough age where people are going to enjoy it and be repeat customers for that brand, tell their friends about it, and they're really happy with the product they put out. So, of course, some other ones to mention would be Penelope, a wildly popular company. We don't get too much of it. In fact, here in BC, we don't get any of it, but we can sometimes get it from our friends and family in Alberta. So Penelope has brands, and in their lineup, they've got a 4-grain. Then Penelope's got a barrel strength version. They've also got a toasted barrel strength version, and they've just released the Architect. So they've got several different products there, and again, they're also sourcing from MGP or Ross and Squibb. Another one that comes to mind is Pinhook, so Pinhook Rye and Bourbons. So there's lots of these non-distilling producers out there, and I think there's a real acceptance in the bourbon and whiskey drinking community about these NDPs now. People aren't upset about their sourcing, they just want it to be transparent. So if a company is sourcing, they just want to know that it is being sourced. They don't, we as bourbon consumers, whiskey enthusiasts, we don't like to have product, that people are pretending is their own, but is actually sourced and not produced by that company. So one of the telltale signs that you can find on these bottles of whiskey, if you want to find out if yours is a non-distilling producer that is sourcing their whiskey from MGP or another source, just look on the side of the bottle here, see where it is from. This one says, distilled in Indiana. Aha! So distilled in Indiana usually means it is sourced from MGP, which is based in Indiana. So this one goes on to say, meticulously blended and bottled by Distillers Way Limited Corporation in Ferndale, Washington. So there you go. So sourced from MGP, blended in-house by Doc Swinson, and then released to the public. Alright guys, so I really enjoyed doing this episode, something fun and different for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it as well, and this helps you out on your search and your journey in the wonderful world of whiskey. Thanks so much for tuning in for this episode. Until the next time, may your sails be full and your drowns be fuller. Cheers.